Somewhere in the ocean, a ship's engine just died. No power. No steering. Just silence, and a crew racing against the waves before the ship turns sideways and everything goes wrong. What actually happens in those next 10 minutes decides if this becomes routine, or a tragedy. Before we get into how we got here, comment where you're watching from, and hit subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you won't want to miss. Picture a container ship the length of 3 football fields, alone in the middle of the Atlantic, hundreds of miles from the nearest port. 4 decks below the waterline, inside a chamber of steel and heat, a single engine the size of an apartment building turns a crankshaft weighing more than 300 tons. It doesn't spin fast, barely 100 revolutions a minute, but every one of those slow, heavy turns is enough to drag tens of thousands of tons of steel and cargo across the ocean. And then, without warning, it stops. The hum that has filled every corner of the ship for weeks simply vanishes. The lights dim. The vibration that sailors stop noticing after a few days at sea, the one that lives in the floor, in the walls, in your own bones, goes quiet. Down in the engine room, the watch-keeping engineer freezes in front of the control panel, because he knows something most people on land never think about: restarting an engine like this is nothing like turning a key in a car. Why is the single most expensive, most powerful, most intelligent machine on the ship also the one that can't simply be switched back on? What actually happens in the minutes after a massive vessel loses power and becomes a helpless dot on the open sea? And why, in an age of computers monitoring every cylinder, does the outcome still come down to a handful of exhausted people with wrenches, working in the dark? Ships are full of redundancy. If one pump fails, a second one takes over. If a generator drops out, another picks up the load. Almost everything on board has a backup, except the one system the whole voyage depends on, the main engine. There is usually only one. It is the thing that gets a ship over the horizon and back again, and out on the open ocean. There is nothing waiting in the wings to replace it if it dies. This wasn't always a vulnerability. For centuries, ships had no engine at all, only sails. A becalmed ship simply drifted, and everyone accepted that storms and dead calms could cost you weeks. Then came steam, and later the diesel engine, and for the first time sailors were freed from the whims of the wind. A modern giant could hold its schedule through almost any weather. But that freedom came with a trade-off. The bigger and more powerful ships became, the more their entire existence came to depend on one single engine. And that engine looks nothing like the one under the hood of a car. There are no spark plugs, no compact pistons tucked into a small block. Picture instead a steel cylinder roomy enough to comfortably stand a grown adult inside. There might be 10, 12, even 14 of these arranged in a row, each piston the size of a small car, rising and falling to turn a crankshaft so massive it has to be forged in sections, because no foundry can cast a single piece of steel weighing 300 tons in one pour. Everything about this machine moves slowly and with enormous force, around 100 revolutions per minute, compared to the thousands a car engine spins through. That slowness is exactly what gives it its endurance, the ability to burn cheap, heavy fuel and run without stopping for weeks at a time. An engine like this costs millions of dollars and will faithfully serve a ship for decades, but only as long as the shaft keeps turning. There are dozens of reasons a main engine can trip offline: a fuel system fault, a drop in lubricating oil pressure, an overheating alarm, a glitch in the control electronics. The cause almost doesn't matter. The result is always the same: the ship loses propulsion, and a powerless ship in open water is at the mercy of the sea. Waves begin to take control of the hull, and if nothing is done, the situation only gets worse from there. The obvious fix seems simple enough: if the engine died, just restart it, the way you'd restart a stalled car on the side of the road. This is exactly where the crew runs into a trap that almost nobody on land realizes exists. A car has a small electric starter motor and a battery. A ship this size has nothing like that. The mass involved is too enormous, the force is too great. Instead, engineers restart the engine using compressed air, blasted directly into the cylinders at high pressure to spin the crankshaft just enough for fuel to ignite and the engine to take over on its own. One engineer once compared it to reviving someone: you have to fill the lungs before the body can breathe on its own. And here's the trap. That starting air doesn't appear out of nowhere. It's stored under high pressure in dedicated air bottles, kept topped up by powerful compressors that run on electricity. That electricity comes from diesel-powered auxiliary generators sitting right next to the main engine, generators that power everything on board, from pumps to the light bulbs in the crew's cabins. And those generators, in turn, need their own pumps supplying fuel, oil, and cooling water to run, pumps that, in many cases, need the very electricity the generators are supposed to be producing. It's a closed loop. To start one system, another has to already be running, which depends on a third, which depends on the first. While the main engine was running, this whole chain was quietly fed by its own power. Air stayed in the bottles. Current stayed in the grid. Oil stayed in the lines. But if the power failure is total, the ship slips into a state sailors describe with one short, grim phrase: dead ship. A complete blackout, in which even the tools meant to wake everything else back up have gone silent. There's usually still enough air left in the bottles for a few start attempts, but no way to refill them until a generator is running again, and no generator will run without power for its own support systems. As long as that reserve of air hasn't been used up, the crew has a window of opportunity. If every attempt fails, that window closes. For exactly this scenario, every large ship carries an emergency generator, isolated and mounted high above the engine room, with its own dedicated fuel supply and its own independent starting system, batteries or a small compressed air bottle. It fires up automatically the instant main power fails. But it's small. Its output is only enough for the essentials: emergency lighting, steering gear, radio, and a handful of critical pumps. It cannot turn a main engine weighing hundreds of tons. So the crew has exactly one path forward: wake the ship back up piece by piece, in a strict, well-rehearsed sequence, starting from that small point of light in the darkness and ending, eventually, at the enormous sleeping heart of the vessel. This is a procedure crews drill again and again in emergency exercises, precisely so that when the real thing happens, they can move without hesitating, without panicking, from memory. It begins with the emergency generator, which comes to life first and gives the ship the bare minimum of power needed to start the chain. With that trickle of electricity, engineers energize the fuel and cooling pumps, and, most critically, start the air compressors. This is where the first real waiting game begins. The compressors slowly build pressure in the starting air bottles, and the needle on the gauge climbs with agonizing slowness while, above, a powerless ship drifts. Once there's enough air pressure, the crew starts the first auxiliary diesel generator, the one that will restore full electrical power. It catches, spins up, and its steady drone fills the compartment as power flows back into the main switchboard. The lights brighten. Instruments flicker back to life. The ship seems to take its first deep breath. Only now can anyone even think about the main engine, and it still can't be brought back all at once. First, the lubrication system has to be primed, so oil reaches the bearings, pistons, and crankshaft like blood into veins. Without it, the metal would grind dry and destroy the engine within minutes of starting. Next comes the fuel. The engine is started on lighter diesel rather than the thick, heavy fuel oil it normally burns. Because that heavy fuel won't ignite cold, the switch back to heavy fuel comes later, once the engine and its heating systems are warm again. Cooling water is circulated to carry away the intense heat about to build in the cylinders. Only after all of that is compressed air finally blasted into the cylinders, hard and brief. The massive crankshaft turns reluctantly at first. Then comes the first ignition. Then a second. A third. And the familiar heavy shudder spreads through the entire hull once more. The heart is beating again. For the people in the engine room, this is a genuine moment of relief, but it's too early to relax. The engine still has to be brought up to a stable running speed and proven capable of carrying load. That's why crews never improvise this sequence under pressure, they rehearse it, over and over, so that in a real emergency it becomes reflex rather than guesswork. From the first click of the emergency generator to the low, steady hum of a revived main engine, many long and valuable minutes can pass. On paper, it reads like a clean checklist. In reality, it happens in a cramped, sweltering, dimly lit space, with the whole ship rolling under emergency lighting, heavy tools sliding across the deck with every swell. The engineers are soaked through, ears ringing, hands slick with oil, and there is no room for a single mistake. Skip the lubrication step and the very first start can wreck the engine. Rush the fuel switch and it won't fire properly. It used to be even harder. In the old days, engineers ran alongside the massive engine with wrenches and mallets, adjusting fuel injection and cylinder clearances by ear, on the fly. Modern engines are smarter, nearly every cylinder now sits under its own electronic control, constantly comparing pressures, fine-tuning injection, adapting automatically to changes in fuel. If one cylinder underperforms, the rest simply compensate. In normal operation, this makes the engineer's job calmer and far more precise. But the instant a ship goes fully dark and everything has to be restarted from zero, that intelligent automation goes silent too, and waits for humans to hand its power back. The person decides. The person acts. The person absorbs the cost of any error. While that delicate, almost surgical work happens below, an entirely different clock is running on the bridge, and it is not on the crew's side. With the engine turning, a ship holds its course and cuts through waves bow first, its strongest angle of attack. Without propulsion, the rudder loses its bite, and the massive hull slowly begins to swing. Wind and waves turn it toward the most dangerous position of all, broadside to the sea. A beam sea rolls a ship harder than any other angle, and in severe weather, that rolling motion alone can be enough to capsize even a large vessel. Sailors fear this turn more than the mechanical failure itself. At the same time, the ship starts to drift. Its towering steel sides act like an enormous sail, and the wind pushes the helpless hull sideways through the water, often toward a coastline, shoals, or rocks. Dropping anchor in the open ocean usually isn't an option either, the seabed can be miles down, far beyond any anchor chain's reach. There is nothing left to do but drift and wait for the outcome. Restarting the engine, in this context, is a direct race against time. Every minute spent below priming oil lines and building air pressure translates, above deck, into dozens more meters of dangerous drift and a few more degrees of dangerous roll. The crew isn't just fighting to save the ship, they're fighting to get the engine running before the hull is swept onto rocks, or caught broadside by the wave that finally proves too much. History offers sobering proof of how thin this margin can be. There are documented cases of large ships losing propulsion from something almost trivial, a cooling system leak, a safety trip, a protective shutdown, only for the delay in restarting to nearly turn a minor fault into a disaster, with vessels running aground or coming dangerously close to it while engineers work to bring the engine back. In some of those cases, luck, tides, or nearby help meant no lasting damage was done. But move that same failure further from shore, into open water, in the middle of a serious storm, and the crew loses both of those safety nets. In the gravest documented losses, a loss of engine power in severe weather has been identified as a contributing factor in vessels being unable to keep their bow into the sea, being turned broadside by hurricane-force wind and waves, and ultimately being lost. In these cases, investigators have generally pointed to a combination of factors: routing decisions, flooding, structural stress, but the loss of propulsion at the critical moment is consistently one of the final links in the chain. As long as the engine is running, a crew retains options. The moment it stops, many of those options disappear with it. These hard lessons are exactly why the modern safety system exists in its current form. Decades of costly failures shaped it. Independent emergency generators that start themselves automatically. A rehearsed, standardized procedure for reviving a fully blacked-out ship. Redundant auxiliary generators, so the failure of one doesn't leave the vessel in total darkness. Smart electronics that continuously monitor pressure and temperature in every cylinder, often catching problems long before they become critical. Tugboats stationed and ready in dangerous, narrow waters to assist any vessel whose heart suddenly stops. Every one of these layers exists because, at some point, a real emergency exposed exactly what was missing. Power loss at sea, in fact, happens more often than most people on land would ever guess. But the overwhelming majority of the time, the story ends quietly, the engine comes back, propulsion is restored, and the voyage continues, sometimes with a reduced speed or a diversion to the nearest port for repairs. If a ship truly can't restart on its own, another vessel tows it carefully to safety. Even with all of this technology, though, none of it replaces the human element, it only supports it. Computers watch the cylinders. Emergency generators stand ready. Tugboats patrol dangerous straits. But in the critical minutes after the great heart of the ship goes silent in the middle of the ocean, everything still comes down to the people below deck, their ability to stay calm, follow the sequence exactly, and wake the giant, link by link, before the sea runs out its clock. So, what actually happens if a ship's engine stalls in the middle of the ocean? First, silence and darkness, something that should never exist aboard a moving vessel. Then, an invisible, desperate race far below the waterline, as engineers hand life back to the ship one link at a time, from the smallest emergency generator, to the compressors, to electricity, to hot oil and fuel, and finally to that first burst of compressed air slamming into the enormous cylinders. And the whole time, a second countdown runs above deck, as the defenseless hull swings broadside to the waves and drifts wherever the wind decides to take it. It's easy to see, now, why the most powerful machine on the ship is also its most fragile point. All of its strength is concentrated in a single unit with no backup, and reviving it after a total shutdown depends entirely on a long, fragile chain of small, interdependent steps, each one carried out in exactly the right order, at exactly the right moment. Whether that chain holds is what decides, every single time, whether engine failure in the middle of the ocean becomes a footnote in the ship's log or the opening line of a tragedy. Every container that reaches port, every box that ends up on a store shelf, passed at some point through people ready to fight that silent, invisible battle deep in the hull. We almost never think about them when we talk about global trade, but they're the ones who decide whether a voyage stays routine or becomes a catastrophe.